Hello AS English students. Today we're going to be continuing discussing the different types of texts that you could come across in AS English. Starting our part 2 with letters. Letters have a very particular format because they have a very particular purpose. Letters are designed to be a one-way form of communication from one person to another person or to a group of people. Because they are so directed, they have a very particular format. On the top right of the page, we always put an address. That is the address that you are sending from, so your address as the writer. Then underneath that, you put the date. Then you leave a space, and then you address it. In other words, you put dear ma'am or sir or dear Emma. And obviously, if it were a formal letter, you would address it to the person using their second name and Mr. or Mrs. or ma'am or sir, or if you don't know the name of the person, to whom it may concern. And if you're on a first name basis with a person or it's someone that you know, then you can just use the first name of the person. So the audience is very specific. And as a result, letters often have a very personal style to them. The person who writes a letter often does it in a very personal way, particularly if it is an informal letter. Then you're likely to see very informal language, contractions, very informal ways of putting things, maybe a lot of emotion put into what they're saying. So if you imagine if you're to write a letter to your friend from overseas, you'd use lots of emotive language. Formal letters obviously won't have that, and they're going to have much more formal language. However, it is very directed because the audience is a lot more narrow than other pieces of writing. The syntax, it varies for effect. So often we can see that short sentences can be used either to be dramatic or to the point or stern or serious and drawing attention to something very particular, whereas longer sentences are often used to create a sense of excitement or being overwhelmed or kind of more a greater array of emotions, I suppose is the way we could put it. We've talked about the layout, the tense, in other words, not the tense, the perspective. Often informal letters are written from a first person perspective. So I, first person perspective, so saying I, me, that kind of thing. More formal letters can also be written from first person, but the language around it needs to remain formal. And letters are almost never written from second person. It's generally you writing it from your point of view. Whether it be informal or formal, we generally write letters from a first person perspective. Letters are generally a little lighter on figurative language and devices because the purpose of a letter is not really in line with trying to like entertain or create imagery. It's more to convey a particular point, and to support that point, you may use some devices, but it's very rarely imagery. You may write a persuasive letter. You also may just write a letter that's being used to convey certain thoughts or feelings, whether that be in a more personal way or in a professional way, like you're writing a letter to your boss requesting a promotion, a personal letter. You're also expressing thoughts and feelings, but in a much more personal kind of way. Paragraphs are generally not used to affect as much in a letter. It becomes less important. Unless it is a formal letter, then you would want to structure your different ideas very purposefully. In an informal letter, it becomes less important because it's more about expressing personal thoughts and feelings. Okay, our next piece of language we're going to talk about is a podcast. This is a little bit of a strange one. I'd like to think it's pretty similar to what you're experiencing on this platform right now. It's almost like, you should know what a podcast is, but for those that don't know, it's audio of someone talking about a particular topic, and them just talking. And generally, it can be one person, but it can also be a group of people having a conversation. And generally, we listen to podcasts for entertainment or informational purposes. Sometimes podcasts are there to persuade people to believe a particular thing. But more often than not, it's sort of to inform and entertain. Sometimes they're used promotionally as well, but it depends on the nature of the podcast. The audience for the podcast is going to be people who are interested in that thing. So there's true crime podcasts where people detail like crimes that have been committed. There's history podcasts, there's tech podcasts, all sorts of fields of interest. And the audience for those podcasts are people that like hearing about those things, who are like driving to work and they want to listen to it, or they're doing things throughout the day, or they're cleaning a house and they just want to listen to something in the background, almost like how you'd listen to music. And the style of the podcast is it's a conversation. It's spoken language, but it is scripted. So the people who do podcasts often write scripts for their podcasts beforehand, and so it's not exactly like spoken language, but it does resemble spoken language in that it's got a very conversational kind of style to it. And the formality of the podcast, the register, whether it be informal or formal, depends on the particular podcast, and it depends on the topics being discussed. It also depends on the personality of the podcaster. So there's some podcasters who are naturally going to sound a little bit more informal and chatty and engaging and conversational. And then there's other podcasters who are going to be a lot more formal and a lot more structured in the way that they approach the topics that they're talking about. The sentences, same way as in spoken language, how we use syntax to make certain points, emphasize certain points and draw out other points. A podcaster will do exactly the same thing in their podcast. The lexis used, they will draw from the lexical field of the topic that is being discussed, whether that be tech or true crime or whatever it may be. Because it's spoken language, we get sort of more higher frequency words, so more day-to-day language being used. Maybe some informal turns of phrase here or there, like saying, okay, or that's fine, or that's cool, or sort of things that you say in your day-to-day language and wouldn't be written down as much. So in order to write a podcast, you really need to nail that sounding like spoken style, and that sort of colloquial language and that use of informal lexis is key to writing a really good podcast. The mood of podcast is generally quite upbeat and chatty and energized because people are listening to it for enjoyment. So they're unlikely to want to watch something that's kind of dour and saddening or dramatic and serious. Often they're very light and chatty and engaging and fun to listen to or to watch. The tense of podcasts is very often in first person. Because of their informal nature, because of their informal style, often they're written in first person because it lends that sort of chatty engagement that you're looking for. There may be the use of literary devices and other figurative language, but generally speaking, not as much, because the language is not very embellished. It's not very flowery, and it's spoken language. So that needs to come secondary to sounding relatable and sounding like you're engaging with your audience in a chatty way. And figurative language is often used in spoken language, but less so. Paragraphs are just used to structure ideas. Paragraphs become less important in podcasts because obviously it's a spoken form of media, not a written form of media. So if you're asked to write one in an exam, or you do come across one in an exam, use the paragraphs to sort of lay out ideas, but don't pay too much attention to them. They're not that important. They mostly indicate just where there's going to be pauses or breaks in thought, or breaks when the podcaster is talking. Okay, the next ones we're going to talk about is, we're going to do two in one here: biographies and autobiographies. For those of you that don't know, biography is a piece of literature written about someone's life, And an autobiography is a piece of literature written about someone's life, but they've written about their own life. And obviously, these are quite similar to each other. And both of them occupy the purpose of informing a very broad audience about someone's life, whether it be their own or someone else's. The reason that the audience is broad is because lots of people read biographies. If you can imagine a biography of Barack Obama, for example, and there is one, there's not one group of people that reads that. There's people here in South Africa that read it. There's going to be people in the UK, people in the States. It's a very broad audience. But it's all people who are interested in the particular person's life, but they're also looking for an element of being able to look into this person's mind, the way they saw things, how their life went. And so there is an enjoyment, a sort of entertainment factor to it as well. The style very closely resembles fiction writing. And so the style is can be quite embellished, it can be quite engaging, and sort of more traditionally what you think of as a book. It resembles fiction. The tone becomes very important in biographies and autobiographies, because generally it's written from a very particular perspective, and so that perspective lends the mood of the different part of the biography or autobiography that you may come across. So if you can imagine a scene or a chapter in a biography of Barack Obama, and it's maybe a scene that involves his family life, and maybe things became loud and disruptive and angry, the tone there is maybe going to be like quite bitter and looking back and regretful, and the mood is going to be quite somber and sad. So think of it almost like movie scenes or pages from a book that read as having a particular mood. The register differs. Some people have a very literary approach to their biographies and autobiographies, and so it sounds very formal, and it's very structured. Other people adopt a more informal way of writing their biographies and autobiographies because they think that that's a good way of sort of engaging with the audience in a more informal, conversational kind of way. So it depends on the particular author's style that they've decided to write the autobiography in. The Lexis will support that as well. So some of them, like we said, resemble fiction, and so the Lexis is going to be quite what we call low frequency Lexis, so more higher order words, less common words, more sophisticated Lexis. Other biographies and autobiographies will use more informal language and chatty language and talk the audience through the different events that make up this particular person's life. Biographies and autobiographies can be written in first or third tense, less commonly in second, almost never consistently in second. But if it's an autobiography, it's often in first tense because the person's talking about their own life. Biographies more often in third person because it's talking about that person and their life. And we're going to see a large range of figurative language in biographies and autobiographies as well, from metaphor, similes, onomatopoeia, personification, all sorts of devices that we associate with literature and prose and books, you're going to see in biographies and autobiographies because they serve a similar function. It's about a real person and their life, but people are also reading it for enjoyment. So it ties into that purpose of informational and educational, but also entertainment and enjoyment. So that's it for biographies and autobiographies. Let's talk a little bit about travel writing. Travel writing is an interesting one because it resembles an article, but the content of the article is to describe what a place is like. And so the purpose is informative. It's to inform the audience that's reading your travel piece what that part of the world is like. And so the audience is naturally going to be people that are maybe interested in going to that part of the world one day, or have already been there, or want to go there one day and want an idea of what the place is going to be like. And because you need to describe this to the audience, the style of travel writing is very often very descriptive. It's very flowery. You can dig into all the devices necessary to paint a picture of the place that you're talking about. So strong use of adjectives and similes and metaphors and other figurative language to create a picture of what this place is like. And the tone of the writer becomes quite important there, because through the tone is the lens through which you see the opinion the writer has of this place. So you can have negative travel pieces, someone who goes to a city in a country and they have a really terrible time and their tone's quite bitter and annoyed and fed up. Similarly, they may go somewhere that's incredible and blows them away, and then their tone's going to support that. Their tone's going to be bewildered and amazement, and they're going to be in awe of the things that they've seen. So the tone will always back up the point of view, the perspective that the writer is going to take. The register depends on where the travel piece is being published, the audience that it's being published to, and the personality of the travel writer. Some travel writers approach travel writing like literature, and so it's very formal and very structured. Other people approach travel writing in a way that you'd approach a blog. So they allow their personality to bleed into what they're writing. They become very conversational. They write from a first-person perspective. And so it depends on the approach that they decide to take. Obviously, a piece being published in a travel blog on a website online is going to be way more informal than a travel piece that is being published in a newspaper, like a well-known newspaper in a city. That's going to be way more formal in its register. It's the lexis of these travel pieces is going to be broad. They're going to pull out all the fancy words that they can think of, and so we're going to get very low frequency words, high fancy sort of prose to describe this place to the best of their ability. And so you can have a very informal piece that has lots of low frequency words, trying to be chatty but also trying to be descriptive at the same time. The format of these pieces, you can have a heading if you want, but it becomes less important. You can just write it straight, like just your paragraphs. It doesn't necessarily need to have a heading or a date or anything like that. Just your paragraphs, and the way it's going to be structured is generally chronological. It's generally, okay, I arrived at the airport, I checked into the hotel, I went to the beach, I met these people, I went to this restaurant. So it's almost following a narrative sort of structure, but really sort of focusing on those descriptive details to bring to life this place that you're visiting. The tense is generally first person in travel pieces, because obviously a ghost didn't write the piece. The travel writer had to be the one to arrive and go to these different places and see these different things, and so it's written from their perspective. It's written from first person perspective, and that's it for travel writing.